Hello and good evening to everyone who have joined us today for this webinar organized by Mumbai Legal Hackers. We are one of the global chapters of Legal Hackers and Mumbai's first open legal innovation community that provides an open, collaborative, and informative platform to all individuals passionate to discuss about topics at the intersection of law and technology. I am your host for today, Ajuni Chawla. Uh, I'm the organizer for Mumbai Legal Hackers, and I'm also a legal tech entrepreneur and legal designer. I would just be spending a few minutes to introduce this platform and sending a registration link in the chat here so you could be a part of this growing community. Legal Hackers is the world's largest legal innovation community. It started in 2012 in Brooklyn. And since then, it has spread across 6 continents and has over 140 chapters worldwide. We are a completely volunteer-run chapter-based community that is open and free to join. Legal Hackers is not a commercial enterprise, trade association, or advocacy group. So we invite you to be a legal hacker now. Today, at this special session, we are presenting a webinar on Canada immigration supported by International Legal Alliance. I would like to thank Advocate Jamshed Mistry to join us here, without whose support and efforts we would not, this would not be possible today. So, and a very warm welcome to Ms. Marina for agreeing to give her expert knowledge on today's subject matter. Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Marina has been practicing immigration and citizenship law exclusively since being called to the bar in 2005. She represents a wide range of immigration and citizenship applications. She is the past national chair of the Canadian Bar Association Immigration Section and past chair for the provincial CB Immigration Law Section. She is also recognized in her domain by best lawyers in 2012. At this juncture, I would again like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to take out your time and guiding our viewers through their immigration process. Thank you, ma'am. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. The subtopics for today are on the slide of your screen. Marina ma'am would be following that sequence. Please make sure to keep your mics on mute for the duration of the session. You may unmute yourself to ask, or please type the questions on the Zoom panel below. I'll bring them up after the presentation when we have the question and answer round. Also, before we begin, I would like to inform our audience that the views expressed by our speaker today will not amount to legal advice on this platform. So now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our expert speaker for today, Ms. Marina Sedai. Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. It's a pleasure to be here. Now, this is going to be a fun session because we get to have a high-level overview of pretty much everything Canadian immigration. But do know that there's so much that lurks below. It's like it could take up to 6 months or a year to really drill down on the subject matter and fulfill all the details. So with that, we will get started. Now, as Junie mentioned, if I'm asked any questions that are case specific today, that's okay. I'll just change them into a general statement because, of course, I wouldn't give legal advice in this kind of situation. So to get started, we're going to first take a look at how does one get into Canada? There's basically two paths. One comes as a temporary resident or a permanent resident. A temporary resident always has an end date to their stay. So that would include students, workers, and visitors. Now, what the end date will be will depend on the circumstances. For persons who are from visa-required countries, it's a little bit tougher to get those statuses in Canada. So to back up for a moment, most countries in the world, most immigration systems split foreign nationals into two groups: those who are visa-required and those who are not. Those who are visa required typically come from countries that Canada has determined have sufficiently different economic and political and social environments that based on past behavior by a certain number of nationals of those countries, that they are more likely than others to overstay or make a refugee claim. These are two things the government really worries about. So they don't want anyone in the country illegally, of course. And despite Canada's reputation for being very refugee friendly, the government, for the most part, works very hard to prevent people from getting here and making a refugee claim. That's one of their primary motivations when assessing a temporary resident application. So the visa application is essentially preliminary, a prerequisite to obtaining later temporary resident status. The visa is the individual, the foreign national's application trying to convince an officer that, look, I will be compliant, I will comply with the terms of my stay, I won't work illegally, I won't overstay, etc. And I have sufficient funds. That's another one. The government is very interested in how much money everyone has. So I have sufficient funds to look after myself without resorting to illegal work. Basically, that's an oversimplification, but that's the gist of it. So we want to differentiate between the visa, which is a document that allows one to get on a commercial carrier, airplane, boat, etc., versus the status that one gets in Canada and the document that represents that. We don't call those visas. Those are called generally permits. So a visitor would enter, not getting anything called a permit. They would enter, they might get a stamp on their passport, and then if they extend their stay later, they would get a document called a visitor record. So it's not called a visitor visa at that point. Or if they're a student and they arrive, they get a study permit, or a worker gets a work permit. Generalizations, but mostly true. So the visa is about traveling. The permits or visitor record are about status in Canada. This is really important when people are already in Canada and they want to extend their status. And if they think, oh, I have a work visa or a study visa, and they try to extend that instead of their permit, trouble ensues. They might find that not only is their visa application rejected, but they might find that they've fallen out of status when they didn't intend to, which is, of course, frowned upon by the Canadian government. So that's what we have for visa required persons. Persons who are not visa required, until recently, it was, they just needed to get on a plane and come here on the strength of their passport. Now they all, except for Americans, need something called an ETA. But still, Indian nationals are subject to visa requirements. But if you or anyone were to have a passport from another country that's not visa required, then they get the electronic travel authorization, the ETA. And it's just very quick. One goes online, just in a few minutes, you type in a little bit of information and you get an automated reply, unless there's something wrong, and then they have more questions and things are delayed. And then that ETA is associated with one's passport, and they can get onto the plane on the strength of that. Of course, everything I'm talking about today, I will avoid the pandemic COVID-19 exceptions because there's a lot of them. So I'm speaking about non-pandemic times. So that's pretty much it. Temporary residence, one applies for the status that they want. They get a visa. If, for example, they're an Indian national to come to Canada, once they're here, they can apply to extend their stay if the circumstances are right. I mean, one has to justify it. What the government does not want are people who come here on a temporary basis and they just keep on getting temporary residence again and again and again, and they become de facto permanent residents. Sooner or later, no matter how good the facts are in an individual's case, the government's going to say, no, you've been here long enough. So individuals like that who really want a long-term life in Canada should be applying for permanent residence. Permanent residence is, in most of the time when we're talking about Canadians, we're including citizens and permanent residents because they all have the same rights except to participate in political life. So one can't run for office, or one can't vote, for example, if they are not a citizen. And the other thing is that permanent residence can be taken away. It can be taken away if someone does something wrong, they've committed a serious enough crime, or they get convicted depending on where the crime happened. But beyond that, there's also residency requirements. Pardon me. So if someone has applied to become a permanent resident, they get here, they can't just leave and years later exercise that again to come back. Canada, from Canada's perspective, if it's given permanent resident status, they want someone who's going to be fairly committed to Canada. So generally, that means that the government expects the individual to be in Canada physically 730 days, that's 2 years, out of every 5 years running. So wherever they are in point of time, they have to be able to show to the government upon demand when they're entering, or when there's certain points at which they would be renewing their permanent resident card. And at that point, they have to show what their residency has been. So the government checks in wherever it can as to, has this person been around enough? If they haven't, then steps can be taken for the government to take away the permanent residence and remove the person from Canada. There's a couple of exceptions to the physical presence rule. I won't get into them today. They're a little more remote to our high-level overview, but nevertheless, that's the gist of it. So temporary residence for temporary stay. If one wants to be here long-term, it has to be permanent residence. And there is something in between called dual intent. And that's when someone is coming here on a temporary basis and they are applying, or they will soon apply for permanent residence. Then they can say, yes, I have temporary intent, very important. And if I'm approved, then I'll form permanent. So this is going to also help, permanent residence will also help with getting citizenship. I won't get deeply into citizenship today, but citizenship as a prerequisite needs at least 3 years of residency in a 5-year period, a static 5 years, for that individual to apply for citizenship. And then, of course, all immigration issues are then behind the individual, and they never have to worry about upkeeping their status in any way again. So that's temporary residence, permanent residence, and touching on citizenship. So now I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We can drill down a bit into the classes of permanent residents. So if one wants to be a permanent resident, they have to fit within a class. And there's family class, and that family class is quite narrow. It's just not having any relative in Canada. They have to have a certain type of relative in Canada who is eligible to sponsor them. That person has to be a spouse or a common law partner. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, a sponsoring party is going to be one of those things, or a parent, right? Or a child, an adult child. Now, backing up a bit, for the family class, married individuals or common law individuals need to prove 3 things, well, 4 things basically. First, of course, as I mentioned, the sponsor has to be eligible. That means that there's not a certain type of criminal history, their finances are okay, they can support the individual coming in. With spouses, there's a bit of an exemption for that income requirement, but money's still important in the application. So with spouses, the sponsor needs to qualify, and the permanent resident needs to prove that first, they meet the definition of common law partners, or secondly, they meet the definition of a spouse, which is generally pretty straightforward. You need a marriage certificate that was correctly executed. But there are exceptions. One can run into, is that marriage, would that be legal in Canada if it were performed here? So, age is an important factor. Legal competency is a legal factor in that assessment. Then, in addition to proving that one is a common law partner or conjugal partner in some cases, I'll explain that in a moment, or spouse, they also need to prove that the relationship is genuine, that it's the bona fides of the relationship. And that's where we really get into the quality. What's going on? How have these people integrated their lives together? Does this really look like a marriage in a somewhat of a traditional sense? So further, I just want to make sure that I see I'm getting messages through from the host, so that's very good. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't alerting me to something that I need to do next. Okay, so with the family class, spouses is qualified, presumably they meet the definition of common law or spouse, and the individual has a genuine relationship. Then, like as with all applications, the individual needs to have their inadmissibilities checked, whether they have any or not. I'll get into inadmissibilities in a few minutes. So with other family members, we have the child, an adult child who can sponsor a parent or grandparent, but that's very limited. It's almost unusable right now. So I know the Indian community in Canada is very keen on that type of application, but it's for the moment, one can't apply in that class, but soon a few people will be able to. And one can also sponsor, of course, children and a few other family members. Now to the economic classes. So there's economic classes include one, immigrating on the basis of their skills, their working skills primarily, or their business skills. First, we'll take a look at the individual worker skills. Now, there are three classes basically for skilled workers on the federal level. There's a federal skilled worker class, and that one has to pass to qualify in that class. One needs to achieve at least 67 out of 100 points. And these points are calculated on human capital, primarily. It's, what's your education? How's your language skill? What is your age? What is your work experience? And so forth. The other class is the Canadian Experience class. That's for people who are already in Canada and have at least 1 year of skilled work experience, amongst other things, but that's the primary qualifier. And then the third class is Federal Skilled Trades class. And this is for much more the traditional trades, think carpenters, electricians, that kind of thing. And it's a very few people come through that class because a lot of those trades people get picked up through other classes. So to apply as in one of those skilled worker classes, one person needs to qualify in them, and then they go into the express entry processing system. This system is a two-stage process, and it's another layer of qualifying. So it's a little bit like applying for a job. You can qualify for the job and you put your resume in, but it's up to the employer as to whether they will select you or not. There might be someone else who's also qualified, but a little bit more so. That's how this express entry system works. So someone's qualified in one of these classes, they go into the express entry system and they put up their profile, some information about themselves, kind of like a dating website, and say, this is who I am, my education, my experience, et cetera, et cetera. And points are calculated out of a scheme of 1,200. Now, the government issues invitations to apply to people who have high enough scores, but how high the scores need to be is sort of an unknown. Even the government doesn't know what the next ITA, invitation to apply round, will be. Recently, it's been floating around 475 and above, once in a while below, but the general trend is that people are getting savvier and savvier at putting up their profiles and qualifying, so the points are generally going up. The pandemic has temporarily pushed them down. And over time, it might be higher than 475 on an ongoing trend basis. If one has enough points and they get that invitation to apply, then they have generally 60 days to put in their electronic application for permanent residence. And this is where they put in all of their history and their information, and they upload documents, etc. They submit that. And then in non-pandemic times, 80% of applications are processed in 6 months or less. So if there's anything complicated on the file whatsoever, any aberration or detail that the officer has to drill down into, it'll take longer. So when Canada's advertising, you can be a permanent resident in 6 months, it's not quite accurate because one needs to gather their documents and their information, prepare their profile, wait for the ITA, get their application in, and then the 6-month clock starts. So I generally tell people that this is much more a year-long endeavor. So now, if one doesn't qualify in this federal scheme and one of those classes to go through express entry, there might be another way as a skilled worker, and that's going through a provincial nominee program. Each province and territory has its own program. They're getting more and more alike, but we really, when somebody's coming to Canada, we have to look at them all, or at least the destinations that they are interested in. In British Columbia, which I think always has had the best one, lucky us, that's where I am. But of course, we help people across Canada, going to destinations across Canada if they're not already here. In that instance, it also has a scheme, a point scheme, and that is out of 200. And it's similar, not exactly the same, that human capital point system, who are you, what's your experience, etc. In that stream, sometimes it's better for some people because in some cases, they don't need to have as high of language skills as they would need to go through the express entry system, which, depending on which class one qualifies in the express entry system, generally has to be at a Canadian language benchmark of 7 or higher. And that is high intermediate. Like, you can pretty much speak at a professional level. And of course, it's writing, reading, and listening as well. With the provincial nominee program, if one has enough points to get through it, they might be able to get away with fewer points or no points for language. But in any case, the way the provincial nominee program works is it's kind of the same scheme as the express entry system, where one puts up their registration, like a EE profile, says, here I am, these are my descriptors, and if they have enough points, they get invited to apply, and then they put in the application. At the end of that, when the government has finished, the provincial government has finished processing it, about maybe 3 or 4 months later, processing times fluctuate. If approved, then the government will issue a nomination for permanent residence and a work permit support letter. So this is one opportunity to, while the individual takes that nomination, puts it into an application for permanent residence and sends it off to the federal government, then takes the work permit support letter sends it off to another government office, and gets a work permit so that they can come work here in the meantime until their permanent residence hopefully comes through. So this is a system that generally, there's a couple of exceptions, but it requires a qualifying job offer. And I think it's about time for me to get into the job offers that are on our list. So that dovetails nicely. Job offers. For the most part, every job offer won't do. The government has rules, of course, and it wants to make sure that Canadians are generally getting first crack at the jobs. And employers who want to hire somebody need to prove that. So the way to get a work permit is, as I mentioned, one way is to get that provincial nominee program work permit support letter because the job has qualified. And another way, so maybe I'll back up for a moment. The work permits are divided into two groups in Canada. One is the International Mobility Program, which is most work permits. The other one is the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which is based on a labor market impact assessment. That's done by the federal government. So one is the LMIA based, and the other is IMP, LMIA exempt. So the PNP, work permit support letter, takes the place of an LMIA, therefore it's in this IMP category. If one is not going through the province and is not going to get that work permit that way, then they can go to the federal government, and the employer needs to, first the employer needs to go to the federal government, and it needs to show that it can't find a Canadian to do the job, and it's a qualifying employer that has a genuine need, and then presumably they can get a labor market impact assessment, an LMIA. The employer gives that to the employee, the foreign national, who then uses it to apply for a work permit. And there are also a few other exceptions to this. So the Temporary Foreign Worker Program with the LMIA exemptions, which include the PNP work permit. There's lots of other ones as well. Now I'm talking first primarily about closed work permits. That means that it's employer specific. That's a large majority of work permits. And they will have, they'll list the employer, the location where one works, exactly the job that they can do and for how long, and certain other conditions. And it's very important that everyone complies perfectly with those conditions, or a whole lot of trouble can ensue. The government is particular and strict about that. So some of the other exceptions to not getting an LMIA and not getting a PNP work permit might be under international agreements or within Canadian legislation. But this is all for skilled work for the most part. There's a few work permits for low skilled workers, but not many. In addition to that, the LMIA based work permit, employer specific, all of these other LMIA exempt work permits that are employer specific, there are a few open work permits. They're not easily available in many cases, but for some people, they're possible to get. Open means that they're not employer specific and there are very few restrictions. For the most part, one is treated just like a Canadian citizen. They have an open work permit. They can go into a Canadian employer and say, you can hire me today. You really don't need to do anything. So a few of those are available. Now, how does one go about finding a job for these purposes? Well, it's not so easy. Now, this is I have a few warnings about fraud in immigration. This is a big one. This is a big source of fraud. People are desperate to get jobs in Canada, ones that will help them get a work permit or gain permanent residence. They therefore encounter a lot of people who will take advantage of them. They say to them, oh, give me 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 180,000 Canadian dollars, I'll get you a job. When extreme charges like that are a red flag that's almost certainly fraud. The fraud goes this way. They charge a lot of money to commit the fraud. These, sometimes they're registered consultants, sometimes they're people who are not registered consultants. I'll talk about that in a moment a bit more. But anyway, these fraudsters will come forward, they'll take money, they'll say, I have a job here for you. You don't have to work in it. You'll get a paycheck and then you'll cash that and give the money, cash money back to the employer. And after whatever period of time, the employer will write an experience letter for you and you can use that to get permanent residence. That is obviously fraud, a very bad thing. And the government is taking steps to try to combat it now, especially the Canadian Visa Office, the consulate in Delhi. It has undertaken a campaign to educate people on, do not do this. They will get hurt. I recently, from time to time, I've had various people in my office taken advantage of as a result of their desperation to get a job in Canada or immigrate. And, I've had people who have been taken for as much as 130,000 Canadian dollars, which is just outrageous. And they didn't actually mean to be doing anything wrong. So all of that to say, beware. How to legitimately get a job? It's tough at a distance. Even in times where the unemployment in Canada is very low, so employers are desperate, like they were for about 3 years leading up to the pandemic. Employers, of course, want to know the foreign national. So number one thing is, forging those relationships. It takes time, but getting to know people in Canada, getting that network together. There's this myth that, in certain countries, you get jobs and other advantages in life by who you know, but it's not that way in Canada. It is that way in Canada, but, it's expressed far more subtly. But really, it makes sense. I mean, if people know you and are familiar with you for some time, then they're more likely to, maybe they won't offer you a job, but they might know someone who can, who's legitimately looking for someone. But beyond that, a huge problem. I've seen thousands and thousands of resumes and job applications from foreign nationals. And I'm very sorry to say that they tend to be quite low quality. There is no cover letter, or if there is, the cover letter only talks about themselves. They don't talk about what they can give the employer. The resumes are, they should be Canadianized. There's a different style that Canadian employers are used to seeing. The human rights law and employment law here discourages the use of photos and personal information like marital status and number of children. That's sort of a no-no here because you're not supposed to be judged on those variables when you're being offered a job. So the next big thing is also spelling and formatting. It's very important to Canadian employers that they see, excellent grammar, excellent formatting, none of this random capitalization or, using a U instead of Y-O-U, that sort of shorthand. That's a surefire way for an application to be dropped straight into the trash. So worthy candidates from overseas that Canadian employers really need don't even get looked at because of the way their application looks. And I would say that less than 5% of applications are of a quality that would even interest an employer to read through the resume and the cover letter. So that's the big thing. Really, it's just quality of the application. And of course, the other thing, as I mentioned, getting to know people, forging those relationships, which takes time and a lot of effort. But in many cases, that's what's required. I mean, it is possible to get a cold call job. There's an ad on the internet, one replies, maybe fills out an online form. So the flow of information is already structured through that format. And that's quite possible that would work, but less likely. So that's essentially how one gets a job. The other thing that one needs to be aware of, and I just want to check the time, we're still okay. The other thing one wants to be aware of is the Canadian government defines jobs in the National Occupational Classification, and then it has 5 levels for those jobs. There's level 0, A, and B. Those are all skilled, and level C and D are low skilled. And for the most part, they can't help with immigration, with some exceptions. So one generally wants to make sure that they're getting a job offer for the right kind of job and that it's otherwise qualifying. So it probably needs to meet certain wage standards. There's something on the Canadian Job Bank. There's, they list, you can go in, check a NOC, National Occupational Classification, in the geographic region where it's being offered, and it will populate with low, median, and high wage for that job in that location. And generally, rule of thumb, a Canadian employer has to offer at least median wage. So that can be a bit of a challenge as well, because a lot of employers don't want to do that. It drives wages up in their view. So it needs median wage. There's a lot of other requirements as well, but on the employer side, they have to be in good standing. In some cases, they have to have existed for a sufficient length of time and have a sufficient number of employees. When I say good standing, I mean that they haven't violated any provincial or federal laws that relate to the workplace, employment laws, essentially. And then they take a look at, okay, so if this employer and the job is qualified, now how about the candidate? Should they, on the basis of this job, get a work permit? And again, there's so many exceptions to everything, but everything I'm saying, that's the nature of law. But as a general statement, an individual is expected to have at least 2 years of experience in that occupation or closely related occupation in order to be qualified, in addition to their any required education, etc. So that's pretty much it for a high-level view of what one would expect when seeking a job in Canada and qualifying themselves. Now we can move on to business. Immigrating as a business person, there is not a lot of choice in Canada. At one time there was, but the federal government and the provincial governments even haven't been terribly interested in bringing business people to Canada. Their main focus has been getting foreign national workers for Canadian employers to fulfill that need. And that made sense when unemployment was very low. Now with the pandemic, the unemployment being incredibly high, will that change, or is it temporary enough that it won't change? We shall see. I've had many meetings online, in person in Ottawa over many of the last 5 to 7 years, trying to convince the federal government to create a solid business immigration program. Again, they're not terribly interested, but I'll tell you what there is. On the federal level, there's something called the self-employed category. It's not what it sounds like. This is primarily for occupations in athletics related to sports or cultural activities, think of the arts specifically. It's not really for anyone else. It's quite narrow. I use it a lot for film and TV industry folks. It's, yeah, we just get a few immigrants in each year through that category. There's also the startup visa or startup business class. It is a very tiny class. The idea there is for, you know, the brilliant graduate student who needs help from business incubators or angel investors. They get that help, they bring their great idea to Canada, and they get permanent residence. That's a very narrow class. Obviously, some people can use it, but you know, it's like a few hundred people a year as opposed to tens of thousands of people a year that come through that. So that's pretty much it on the federal level. Provincially, each province and territory are different, and I'll once again use British Columbia as an example. But it has an entrepreneur stream where one can buy into a business, and how much the net worth and the investment vary according to where they're going to be having the business. But they have to come here and run the business on a work permit for a while, prove that they can fulfill certain requirements with the business, and then they can move forward through the permanent residence process. Now, again, you know, I tell people don't get too excited about that if you're a business person, because again, BC is a very good example. It can nominate roughly 6,500 people per year at the moment. And of those, I think something like 75 are business people. So they don't pick many. And the other thing, all the minimum investment requirements and minimum net worth requirements, it's sort of misleading because they have so many people sending in applications that there's presumably all of the big pile of applications meets the minimums, but there's going to be a few that go far beyond that. And of course, the province is going to be interested in those ones, right? It's not particularly the best way for most people to immigrate. Quite often business people are very surprised when they come to me and say, you know, I'm a business person, I want to invest in a business, tell me how to do business immigration. And my first response is, hold on, we're not going to assess you as a business person, let's assess you as a skilled worker. And they're like, but I'm not a worker, I'm not an employee, I'll employ myself. Doesn't matter. We might be able to get you through as a skilled worker because you have skills, you have good human capital. Maybe, maybe not. If we can't, then we'll look at the business immigration streams. Okay, so now before, I'm going to go back into study permits. I see that's on the list at the end. But before I do that, I want to go back to something I promised I would talk about, and that's inadmissibilities. That applies to temporary residents, whether they're visitors, students, or workers. It applies to permanent residents qualifying and trying to keep their permanent residents. So inadmissibilities the issue for immigrants doesn't go away really until they're citizens. And then they're only subject to, you know, maybe criminal and civil law liabilities if something goes wrong. But they are this. Though there's some of the obvious ones, like you can't be a spy, you can't be a war criminal, you can't, you can't belong to organized crime. Those, I think, people just intuitively know that if that's in their history, they're going to have a problem. But it's also less obvious things like finances. The government does not want someone coming to Canada who, not that they would, but could qualify for financial aid in Canada, like welfare, social assistance, what provinces give people who don't have enough money to live on, who are destitute. They're very careful about that. So one can have a perfectly good temporary resident or permanent resident application, but if an inadmissibility comes up, it can shut down the application and result in a refusal. So in addition to the obvious ones and financial inadmissibility, there's also health. For most categories, everyone's going to need a medical, and that's to determine, one, if they have something that would harm the public. Health inadmissibilities don't really arise on that basis too often. It's more so that they're going, we have a public health care system here, and it's very expensive. It costs the government more than anything else. I think I once heard a stat, something like 40% of the budget. It's really expensive. So the government's trying to make sure that people don't come here who will use it a lot. And if someone has a pre-existing condition and it's really expensive to treat that, they're too expensive according to a certain threshold, they're going to be found to be medically inadmissible. The next one is a huge one. It is misrepresentation. And so misrepresentation, it's a spectrum. On one end, we have purposefully lying, giving false information to mislead. We all know that's bad. And in my 15 years of practice, rare has it been for me to come across anyone who wanted to be anything other than honest. On the other end of the spectrum is where people get caught. This is where they are, they innocently don't know that they were supposed to include information. And so there's an omission. Or they misread a question and they answer it wrong. It could be a whole sort of innocent things. And the government can, depending on what the information is that was given or missing, can determine that that is misrepresentation equal to lying. If they find that, they refuse the application. There's a 5-year bar on even applying for any kind of status in Canada. If they're in Canada, they're removed generally. And even after that 5 years pass, the government is going to look at any application they send in suspiciously and be more than happy to find a reason to refuse it, in my view, from what I've seen. And also the findings of misrepresentation have been increasing and increasing. In the last 18 months, so it's just been quite the pastime at the federal government to refuse people on that basis. So it's serious business. And the one more inadmissibility I want to mention is how this applies will depend on what one's applying for as a temporary resident or permanent resident. But if one has an inadmissible family member, then they can also be inadmissible. The whole family can be inadmissible. And by family, I mean everybody on the application. That's generally parents and dependent children, and spouses, of course. So the main thing I really worry about is misrepresentation that can be found for a whole host of reasons. Okay, so I think we're still doing okay for time. I'll just keep going. If Junie, if I'm going past the time you would like me to, just let me know. We're okay? All right. So I'm going to go to study permits and drill down on that a bit. So getting a study permit for Canada, it's much better now. The universities and colleges lobbied hard a few years ago for Indian nationals to be given a chance, basically. I mean, at one time it was almost hopeless. You're an Indian national, forget about it. It's almost certain to be a refusal. So things have really changed, but there's a lot of fraud going on in going through Delhi, our visa office in Delhi. So the refusals have increased in the last, I would say, about 2 years, but they're still better than they were, say, 10 years ago. In any case, if somebody's coming here to study, essentially the application needs to make sense. We always want to think about the human being who's going to receive that application at her desk, and she's sitting down with her morning coffee. Maybe she hasn't had all the caffeine yet, so we want to make the application very clear. Spell it all out for her. Maybe it's her first day on the job. We always write applications as though the officer either hasn't had enough sleep or they've never processed an application before. We teach on our applications. So it needs to be nice and clear, but it needs to make sense. I mean, if somebody is taking a left turn in their life and they want to come to Canada to study something that has nothing to do with their previous education, nothing to do with any work experience they have, and they're already getting a bit older, for example, then they're going to have to explain how this is a genuine desire to study. Why does this make sense in their life? How will this benefit them in their career? So in addition to, you know, just communicating to the person who's going to be reading the application and says, you know, why should I let this person study in Canada? Are they really coming to study here? In addition to that, they want to know about the money. So we're back to how important money is. For students, they have to show that they have enough money for the first year. They don't have to show that they have enough money for the years after that. That might change. We will see. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 2 or 3 years it changes. But just having spoken to some of the immigration ministers and departmental officials and their take on this, but we'll see, maybe not. In any case, 1 year worth of expenses. The wisdom here is to not show the minimum, because lots of people have the minimum, but to show if there's more, if the individual's would-be student or their family or benefactor have a lot more money than the minimum, then show a lot more money. It really creates trust for the officer who's deciding it. Like, yeah, this person is not going to be in a position where they will sneak out of school and work illegally. We're always worried about that. So, you know, we can trust them to be more likely to comply with the terms of their stay. So there's other variables as well, but I mean, the study permit application needs to make sense. There can't be any inadmissibilities, and the person needs to have sufficient or more than sufficient, really, money, in my view. Once a student gets here, there's lots of rules. It's become stricter and stricter because a lot of students were violating the rules. They would get here on a study permit, and then they'd find a job, jump school, and just work under the table at the job. So that's a really good way to get oneself deported and never be able to come back to Canada. So very foolish move. But a lot of people thought it was a good idea. As it is in Canada now, students are, if they're going to a qualifying educational institution, they can work up to 20 hours a week during regularly scheduled classes, the terms, and as much as they like during regularly scheduled break, like our summer break or winter or spring break. And there are a few restrictions on that, but for the most part, they're able to get, you know, support themselves and get some work experience in Canada. If they go to the right program and the right institution, then they might be eligible for a co-op work permit, and which is where you take a term off from classes and you get placed in a job that relates to what you're learning about. You can get a co-op work permit, and also in some cases a post-graduation work permit. Now, this post-graduation work permit is a beautiful thing. It is equal in length to the duration of the educational program if the program is 8 months to less than 2 years. If the program is 2 years or longer, then the post-graduation work permit would be a 3-year permit. And this is an open work permit, so employers don't need to do anything except hire you on the spot, hopefully. Now, here's a warning. Again, we go back to the system's rife with fraud. There's something that's happening, and it's legal, but I don't like it. I think it creates a conflict of interest, and it's this. There are immigration consultants who will take a student on, charge them to do the study permit, that's fine, and convince them to go to a certain institution and a certain program because they get a kickback. Well, perhaps I shouldn't use the word kickback, but that's what it is. They get a commission from the educational institution. And sometimes they don't tell the student that that's one of the things that motivated them to tell the student to go to that school and take that program. So, you know, for anyone who's getting help and they come across that kind of scenario, someone who's getting a commission from the school, I would never accept a commission from school. But it's there and it's legal. But then, do they really have the student's best interests at heart? What happens here is that the student then might end up in a program that doesn't look after their best interests, because it might be a program where they can't work up to 20 hours a week during classes. They'll never get the post-graduation work permit. They'll finish the program. They have no hope of immigrating. They have to leave Canada. That happens so much. One colleague of mine, one of his clients, committed suicide at the end of his program because he realized that his family's money had been spent on this education in Canada. He had been misled by a consultant that he would be able to use that education to immigrate. And he felt hopeless. And so, very tragic case, but it hurts a lot of people. Now, just before now, another thing I promised to go back to before I end, I kept on saying that I would get into the issue of who can represent. And it's this: under Canadian law, only a Canadian lawyer, that's someone who is licensed by a provincial or territorial law society, can represent individuals on everything in immigration law, on applications, going to court, etc. In recent years, consultants have come onto the scene in the last decade or so, and they can't go to court, but they can help with applications. Now, there are some very good immigration consultants out there. But there are a lot of bad ones, especially if they're not registered and they're doing it secretly. The problem is that they take people's money. They quite often give them bad advice. They hide. They don't show themselves on the application, so that's why I call them ghost consultants. Then, because of the content of the application being wrong, or because it's discovered that there's a ghost consultant, somebody gave the individual advice and put together the application for them, but isn't registered, didn't put themselves down on the application as they're supposed to, then misrepresentation is found, and then disaster ensues. So the nugget here is never get immigration law advice or representation from anyone except an immigration consultant who is registered in Canada or a Canadian lawyer. And the other tip, a bit of a pro tip, if you go to a website for a lawyer or a consultant and you can't see who's there, it doesn't have like, our team, my name is Marina Sedai, here's my picture, this is our address, we are transparent, this is who you're dealing with, here's the team, everyone you'll be speaking with. If that's not there, take that as a red flag, and in my view, you should run away just to protect yourself. Okay, so that's, I think I've covered the main topics that we had listed. Now I'm very happy to get questions.
Hi, I have a question for you. I am a piano teacher in India, and I've just married a Canadian national. I am 53 years old and he is 70 years old. We just married in the month of February, and I have already given in my outland PR application, of which we have not received any client number, but we've just received a receipt. That's it. Now with this pandemic, we are wondering what should we do next, because my husband really wants me to come over as soon as possible. And I don't see that coming. So we're all in two minds as to what to do. So there's a two-part question from me to you, is that if I leave for Canada now, when the airways start, is it better to cancel my current outland PR application and start afresh? Would you advise that?
Yeah, so that's actually a big question for many, many people. So in general terms, there's two processing streams for spousal sponsorships. That's inside of Canada, and that one requires that the person is in Canada living with their Canadian sponsor.
Correct.
Or the outside of Canada stream, and Canada doesn't care where the individual is in that instance, just as long as they're legally wherever they are. So they could be in Canada, they're country of origin, a third country, on the high seas, they don't care. So getting temporary residence in the meantime is, you know, this is where we come to that visa required and visa exempt divide. Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Okay.
You already have a visa, so that's spectacular.
Yeah.
I'm going to say this part because it applies to so many people. If they're from a visa required country and they have a spousal sponsorship in play and they want to come to Canada, or even if they don't have the spousal sponsorship in play yet, but they want to come to Canada to see their beloved, they're probably going to be refused. Not always, but I would give it like a 2% chance. So it's possible, and there's no reason not to try, but manage expectations. Now, if one has a visitor visa and they can come to Canada and nothing has arisen that would make them inadmissible, then there's certainly case law, the legislation, but certainly case law that underscores to Canada Border Services Agency and all the players, the Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada Department as well, that an individual can have something I mentioned earlier on, and that's a dual intent. So,
correct.
Yeah. So, but what people, you know, go ahead.
So if I enter Canada with, how do I prove to the officer on arrival that I will return to India in case my PR is rejected? I have a 6-month stay on my tourist visa, and my visa is valid till 2027. So the tourist visa.
Right. So this is where, this is where it can get actually quite complicated, because it really looks at an individual's life and their history, and everyone is unique, right? But an officer is generally looking for, okay, what was past pattern of travel? What, did this person travel around the world and they're always compliant? Did they travel to Canada and leave in a reasonable time?
Yes, I've done that all the time.
Yeah, so past behavior can predict future behavior. We know this is human nature. So what would motivate this person to leave Canada? Do they have a home? Do they have a potential job? Do they have family that they have obligations toward? Do they have young children outside of Canada? Do they have a business outside of Canada? Are they needing to go back to finish their education? I mean, one's life, there's so many different life fact patterns. But why would they possibly go back to leave Canada? Now, so I have somebody coming in, and I do these all the time, a visa exempt individual. And this is very common. We just lay out the facts that, you know, here the person is asking for temporary stay. If always be truthful. Sometimes people they're scared that the facts won't make the officer very happy, so they try to hide them. But like in this instance, one can say that, like, look, I have dual intent. I have a permanent resident application in play. I do not have permanent intent yet. I'll form it if my permanent residence application is approved. Allow to have it then. But for now, it's temporary intent with the hope of permanent residence. And that's called dual intent. If that's, you know, the truth, then that's the truth. So a letter I wrote yesterday is this individual is seeking entry for 6 months, because we know CBSA, that's what all you like to issue stays for. They can do longer, but they usually don't want to. So 6 months, and we will seek a visitor extension. But at any point in time, if this individual needs to leave Canada, they're able and willing to do so. A big one there is money. You know, somebody shows up and they say, okay, I'm here under these circumstances, but I have $10 to my name. Might be on the next plane back to country of origin.
Okay. Thank you very much. And should I change my PR application to inland once I go there? Is that possible?
Yeah, so one can't, if they're in the inside of Canada stream and they want to switch to outside, or in the outside of Canada stream and they want to switch to inside, they can't just ask the government, like, can you, the application you already have, can you just place it in the other stream?
No. I have to reapply in the other stream.
That's right. But one, would check as to, why.
Why? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some cases, it might be the right thing to do. In other cases, it wouldn't be the right thing to do.
Okay.
Look at the individual circumstances in each case.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
So, ma'am, we've got a question for you in the chat panel. How can a student convert a work permit to a PR?
Right. So how does one really use work experience to gain permanent residence? So there's a few ways. Before I was describing those point systems, so the classes, so there's a point system for federal skilled worker, and you can get points for work experience. There's a Canadian experience class, which requires 1 year of skilled work in Canada. And then you get through the rest of the express entry point system. And so in that way, the work experience will help. Let's say one's here after school on a post-graduation work permit for 3 years. Hopefully, they're going to have out of those 3 years at least 1 year of skilled work experience plus enough points to get through the express entry system. There's also in British Columbia, and again, not all provinces are the same, but when going through the provincial nominee program, persons who are graduating from pretty much anything except master's and PhD programs, they can, if they have a job offer, they can go through the student stream at the BC PNP. And the reason that is interesting is that usually someone needs at least 2 years of work experience in that occupation that they're being offered a job in to qualify in the PNP skilled worker stream. For students, they might get out of school, they have a job offer, but they have no work experience that would qualify them, then it's okay. If the job offer, if it's a qualifying job offer, they can still go through the BC PNP system as a student. So that's one way. That's pretty much it. There's one thing I would like to add to all of that, and people are always worried about coming to Canada or with their spouse. How am I going to go to school and support my spouse who's hopefully with me? If that's the case, the spouse can, again, if it's a qualifying educational program, can get an open work permit and work while the individual is going to school. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, we've got 2 more. So there's one which says, does a tourist have to register with authorities on arrival, like India has the Foreigners Regional Registration Office, something like that? So
yeah, no, so all that happens is that one gets that preliminary authorization to travel to Canada, the visa, and upon arrival, there's a Canada Border Services Agency officer, at that initial primary inspection line booth, who will ask you some questions, and at that point decide whether you get to enter and for how long, and if there's any additional conditions that they wish to impose on you. So in that sense, your passport is swiped in. The officers aren't usually stamping passports anymore. They do sometimes, but for the most part, they just swipe it and it goes into their computer system. The system is getting a little fancier. Before, it used to only note incoming, right? Because you're there, they swipe it, they know who came in, but they had no exit controls. Now there's hugely increasing exit controls, and there's going to, as time goes on, there's going to be a better and better defined record of when the individual left and if it was on time. So in that way, they'll be keeping track of people. And so for students, if something happens where the student stops going to school, is playing hooky, then the educational institutions are under an obligation to report the student. So they're keeping a very close eye on whether students are compliant while they're here. Okay, hopefully that answers your question.
yes, I'm sure. Then the last question is that in case someone overstays, what procedure is followed by the authorities for deportation and the legal remedies available to such an individual?
Yeah, so that dovetails perfectly from the last question and answer. So for the most part, if somebody was overstaying, they didn't really know. However, Canadians are renowned for being so nice, not all of us, because about 50% of the investigations are based on poison pen letters or phone calls, emails, etc. What I mean by that is Canadians or foreign nationals who are here, very often it's foreign nationals who are here who are in status, and they don't like it when somebody else is here who's out of status and they're trying so hard to comply. But whoever it is, and they tell the government, hey, you know, there's this person next door or at the shop down the street or at my school, and I don't think they're following the rules. I don't think they are legally here. The government's very happy to get that information and excuse me, will go and try to hunt that individual down. There's also other ways. I mean, it's very common for, you know, if somebody's driving, they forget their turn signal, they get pulled over for it, or they're speeding, and the officer very quickly figures out they don't have status in Canada. It's so easy to come to the authorities' attention. And CBSA has many units across Canada. That's all they do 24/7 is investigate and drive around and try to find people. So it was already a thriving part of day-to-day life in the government, finding and deporting overstays. But now with the increasing record of who is here and have they left when they were supposed to, there's going to be a way, and I expect to see this develop more in like 2, 3, 4 years from now, where I anticipate there'll be officers going through this and software that'll pluck out the people who appear to still be here, and they will start looking for those individuals. Now, if they find them, well, first of all, let's say they don't find them, and somebody, you know, just leaves of their own accord and nobody notices. Then when they want to come back, they have to put that down on their application. It'll be a question on almost all applications, and they need to confess. If they don't, then it's misrepresentation, which is a terrible fate. But if they do confess and it's a temporary resident application, it's likely to be refused, not necessarily, but likely. They'll need to really explain themselves. Or if it's permanent residence, and it's probably not very relevant. They don't care because they're asking to stay here permanently. So why would they be worried about an overstay? Good, you want to be here. You're applying for permanent residence and you want to be here permanently. It all works. But what are the remedies? Well, after, you know, from time to time, much to my surprise, I have people who come to me and say, hey, I didn't notice that my work permit, my study permit, my visitor status expired. If it expired in the 90 days before that moment in time, then one can apply for something called a restoration of status. It takes a long time, many months to process, and they really have to fall on their sword and explain themselves. Again, we have a human being on the other end trying to make a decision. So they have to really well explain themselves and justify the reasons for their ongoing stay that they're asking for. If they're outside of the 90 days, then most of the time my advice is leave Canada but sometimes there's really big reasons for them wanting to stay, something really compelling. Maybe they're here to look after their cousin who has no one else in Canada, and that cousin has a terrible illness and they're looking after them. Or, you know, there's other things like they have a child who is, having a child here isn't a get out of jail free card at all, but maybe there's a reason why this child needs to stay. Again, maybe medical treatment. So there's some really compelling circumstances where one might ask for a temporary resident permit, a TRP. And TRPs are a document that very discretionary. The officer can easily say no. The officer has to really feel compelled and think that it's well justified to issue one of these. And it's for somebody who shouldn't be here. They're inadmissible because they were non-compliant, whatever the problem is. But there's enough reason that they're going to make an exception. But that's an exceptional. At that point, anyone in that situation really needs a lawyer. And this is not something that it's wise for them to do by themselves. Not a simple matter. They need legal advice as individuals, and they probably need representation on that. It's possible, I mean, legally it's possible for one to put in their own TRP application, but most of the time it's not advisable. So.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for this really informative session. For all of those who are listening to Ms. Marina tonight, I encourage you to email her on her email ID mentioned here. Again, thank you so much, ma'am, for your expert insights to immigration. And I'm sure all of our participants today, had this really like a proper insight as to like what should their next step be, and that would enable them to ensure that their dream to go to Canada comes true. So thank you so much for taking out your time. Tomorrow you will be receiving a survey asking for feedback on this event. Your insights will help us shape future events such as this. And also we will send you a link of the recording so that you can share it with your friends, family, and on your social networking sites. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed this. It was fun.